Welcome back to another Kray video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any videos. And for people really interested in the Krays, check out our private Facebook group, Krays Crime Lords of London. A direct link for the group is in the YouTube description section. We're a friendly and moderated group which has been running since January 2018. Come and give us a try sometime.
Hello again and welcome back. We continue the story of our journey through the madness of the 1950s and 60s London gangster scene, when me and my brother Ron ran the East End and other parts of the capital with fear. Travelling around our manor wasn't always just meeting up with associates. Occasionally we had to step in and sort out the trouble. It was during this period that we had a gambling club at Wellington Way, back towards our manor in Bow Road. Georgie Woods and Jackie Reynolds, along with Limehouse Willie, ran the club for Charlie, Ron and me. One day at the club, Jackie had an argument with Buster Osborne, who had been a successful professional welterweight boxer. I was in the club that day and I noticed them having words. Then I saw Jackie walk away and sit down at a table with Sammy Josephs. Sammy had recently finished a 10-year sentence in Dartmoor for his part, along with Jimmy and Georgie Woods, in the London airport gold bullion robbery. Keeping my eye on Jackie, I saw him get up from the table and go to the fireplace in the centre of the room, pick up a poker and push it deep into the glowing coals. I went over to him and asked him what the problem was, and he said, "I'll show the bastard if he wants trouble." Buster was also a friend of mine, and I didn't want trouble in my club, so as diplomatically as I could, and without Jackie losing face, I managed to persuade him not to carry out his threat. If trouble had flared, there was no doubt that he was more than capable of doing what he intended. Crossing the Mile End Road and heading north, I might stop at the Spread Eagle pub on the corner of Shoreditch, the pub used by Alfie Allpris and Nobby Clark. Alf was over 6 feet tall and broad, while in contrast, Nobby was quite short. Nobby had served a couple of sentences for theft and violence, and he was a friend of Frankie Fraser and Johnny Collins. Alf, whom I shared some time with in Parkhurst, carried a lot of weight in criminal circles and was respected by all. Of course, Soho was a glamorous destination at the time, and we'd often end up there. Sometimes I would go to a club run by Peter Gillam and his brother and have a drink with my friend Alfie Gerard. Alfie came from Canning Town and was well known all over London for being a good gunman. One time he'd pulled a shooter on Buller Ward when they had a flare-up while drinking in a club down the meat market. This was not a liberty on his part, as Buller himself was a very capable villain and hard man. In fact, I had a run-in with him myself at the Regency Club. We had a disagreement that ended with me giving him a right-hand punch on the chin. As he staggered back, I pulled a German flick knife out of my pocket and cut him across the side of the face, opening his face up from the corner of his eye to his mouth. Looking after my interests, Roy Nash, who was in the club at the time, bolted the door to stop anyone leaving and perhaps calling the police. There was blood all over Buller's royal blue suit and on the foyer carpet, but with the business done, I had him taken to the London hospital, where he needed 100 stitches to pull his face together. Looking back, I'm not proud of such violence, but they were the times we lived in, and given the chance, he would have done to me what he'd done to many others. Leaving Alf and the Gillam brothers, I would probably head for the Pigalle Club, just off Regent Street, to see Scotch Jack Buggy. He'd be sitting at a table close to the stage where Shirley Bassey would be captivating the audience with her singing. Jack was a very flash villain, and at one time he'd been given a 10-year sentence when he was convicted of shooting Big Charlie Reader in the stomach outside the Pig Ale Club. Charlie was lucky to live, but some years later, Buggy went missing and was never seen again. As I've said, Memories are very long in the underworld. The Pen Club was a favourite East End haunt for many villains. It was situated in an upstairs building in the vicinity of Spitalfields Market. During the early hours, the patrons would start to drift in, with the assurance that genial company and a relaxed atmosphere awaited them. It wasn't renowned for being a trouble spot, in fact quite the opposite, which accounted for its popularity at this hour of the day. During one particular drinking session, an altercation started between the club owners, Jimmy Cooney and Billy Ambrose, and some customers who were not members. They were led by Jimmy Nash, who had 7 brothers. Jimmy was a well-known figure in the London underworld and had a certain reputation. He was of strong build, with a thick bull neck, and sported a short-cropped crew-cut hairstyle. Others in his party that night were Joe Pyle and John Reed. Reed was the son of a Croydon policeman, and like Pyle, had once been a professional fighter. Billy Ambrose was well known as an ex-middleweight professional fighter, and at the time he was on parole after serving a prison sentence at Dartmoor. He'd been sentenced to a term of 11 years for stealing a large quantity of gold pens from a warehouse, which explains how the Pen Club got its name. The argument in the Pen Club was beginning to escalate. As Cooney and Ambrose advanced towards Jimmy Nash to try to calm the situation down and prevent any further incident, it was alleged that Nash removed a German Mauser pistol from his coat pocket and fired point blank at the approaching men. Jimmy Cooney was hit in the chest, and Billy Ambrose caught it in the stomach. Cooney staggered down the stairs to the dimly lit street, blood gushing from the wound in his chest. Then his balance gave way and he keeled over to fall in the gutter. His girlfriend rushed to him and cradled his head, but the shot proved to be fatal, and Jimmy Cooney died where he lay. Billy Ambrose had the presence of mind to jump in his car and drive to the London hospital, where emergency surgery saved his life. The fact that Ambrose had kept his body in peak condition and was extremely fit and healthy probably contributed to his recovery. After the fatal shooting, Jimmy Nash, Joe Pyle and John Reed left the Pen Club and headed straight for my mother's house in Valence Road to seek assistance from Ron and me. They told us they were in a bit of trouble, which we thought was the understatement of the year. Jimmy Cooney had once managed a drinking club for Aggie Hill, the wife of Billy Hill, before they divorced, so we were familiar with Cooney and his girlfriend. Also, Ron and I had always had a good relationship with Billy Ambrose, beginning when we trained together at Bill Klein's gym. Billy was a man of good principles, so I felt I would be able to reason with him. My decision to pay Billy a visit at the London hospital was for 2 reasons. One was out of respect, and the other to find out the information I needed to be clued up on how many witnesses were present on the night in question. They would have to be intercepted and asked, or coerced, not to give evidence against the accused Nash, Reed and Pyle. Just before I entered the hospital ward, I carefully looked around the corridor to see who was present. I noticed a woman I recognized as Billy's wife, but thankfully no law. I acknowledged other friends in the room with a nodding gesture as I politely asked Billy's wife for permission to visit her husband for 5 minutes, to which she agreed. I was in a bit of a dilemma with the assignment I had undertaken. As I said, I had the utmost respect for Billy Ambrose, and he knew it. Being a man of sound principle, I felt certain that he wouldn't deviate from our moral code and prosecute Nash and the others. Yet here I was, pleading leniency on the accused's behalf to their victim. As it turned out, he didn't take my plea as a personal slight against him, and knowing that made my conscience a bit easier. Jimmy, Joe and John were eventually arrested and charged with murder, and the trial was to take place at the Old Bailey. While the trial was pending, Ron and I visited Jimmy Nash, who was on remand in the hospital section of Brixton Prison. It was normal practice to admit murderers onto the hospital wing. A screw sat close to Jimmy while we spoke and took notes to record the conversation. Jimmy was not at all intimidated or perturbed by the officer's presence, and as we continued to speak, he made a noose out of a thread of cotton and dangled it to and fro. Jimmy always did have a bizarre sense of humor, and this little joke seemed to please him immensely. I'd made a point of meeting all the witnesses to the shooting and invited them to the R Club for drinks. As I sat drinking with Jimmy Cooney's girlfriend, she intimated that she would disappear for a while in exchange for a favor. Apparently, she had some medical problems and required the immediate services of a good doctor. Fortunately, we had an excellent doctor on the firm and a compromise was reached. During the trial, I sat with Jimmy Nash in the part of the court set aside for the accused's family. Jimmy Nash was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Joe Pyle and John Reed were both acquitted. Ron and I were with the other members of our firm, sitting in a gambling club at Wellington Way in Bow. When the news bulletin giving the result was transmitted, we were all ecstatic with the result and raised our glasses to Jimmy, Joe and John. We also toasted the health of Billy Ambrose, who not only refused to testify against the accused, but actually helped them in their defense. Today, Billy Ambrose is a highly successful businessman, and in the opinion of Ron and me, he deserves everything he's got because it couldn't have happened to a nicer fella. Our manor was home to people of many different backgrounds. To be a foreigner in the London underworld didn't mean you had to have been born outside British shores. There were plenty of other people who felt out of their depth among us. Peter Jenkins, known as the Mayfair Playboy, was one such person. He had been convicted of a jewellery robbery in the 1950s that took place in a hotel in the Mayfair area. Jenkins and his accomplice had booked into a Mayfair hotel under false names and then phoned a jeweller and asked the manager to bring a tray of valuable rings to them in a briefcase at a specified time. He took the tray of rings out and displayed them on the table in the hotel room so that they could look and select an engagement ring. When the manager placed the jewellery on the table, they did not hesitate to bludgeon him around his head with coshes until he fell to the floor with blood gushing from his head wounds. They picked up the jewellery, placed the tray in a small case and left the hotel. Sometime later, Peter Jenkins was arrested with his colleague and charged with malicious wounding and robbery. They had been spending the proceeds in various nightclubs in such a way that they had drawn attention to themselves. When Peter Jenkins appeared at the Old Bailey in No. 1 Court, the gallery was packed with debutantes and society people. They had come to see their fallen member even though he was disgraced. Jenkins and his co-accused were sentenced to 7 years penal servitude. Peter was sent to Dartmoor prison to serve his sentence. Ron and I looked after him with tobacco and the odd bottle of scotch while he was inside, and let him know that when he was eventually released, he could come and see us at the R any time and we would be pleased to see him. He did turn up, and when I greeted him, I could not help feeling sorry for him because the sentence had taken its toll on a person whom I had weighed up as a non-criminal type. Despite the fact that he had just come out of prison, it was obvious that criminal society was unnatural and alien to him. The R Club was frequented by criminal types as well as straight people, and when Peter was in conversation with some of the criminal element, I could see he was like a fish out of water. It was obvious to me that it must have been the same for him when he was in Dartmoor prison, which must have made his sentence that much more of an ordeal. He was now an alcoholic, and all he had left was his educated way of speaking and his gentlemanlike ways. I gave Peter Jenkins a few quid and made his evening as comfortable as possible, plying him with drinks. Some years later, I read a daily newspaper which had a very small write-up in it that read, "Peter Jenkins, alias the Mayfair Playboy, has been found dead in a lodging house in the area of Bayswater. He died of alcohol poisoning." It seemed he could not pick up the pieces to start a new life, and his conviction banished him from high society. I found Peter Jenkins an interesting but sad victim of life's stage. Peter Jenkins wasn't the only unlikely character to be found in the East End. Not everyone in the East End of my youth had British heritage, even if this wasn't immediately obvious. Take Albert Dimes, for instance. Albert, whose real name was Alberto Di Maio, was a central figure in the Soho area, and yet his connections stretched well beyond the boundaries of the West End. He owned a betting shop there, and Henry Cooper, the former heavyweight champion of Britain, was often seen in his company. Because Albert was a regular fight fan and was present at all the main tournaments, he towered over 6 feet tall with sleek black hair and elegant, handsome features, all generated by his Italian heritage. He controlled the point-to-point meetings all over the country and always ensured that Ron and I had decent pitches at the courses. Albert was a very likable person with a pleasing personality and a tendency to chain smoke constantly. Ron and I were in his betting shop, and hanging on the wall were the gloves that Muhammad Ali and Henry Cooper had worn while fighting each other. They must have been very valuable and treasured possessions, but without hesitation he took them down and presented them to us as a gift. One of the last meetings I had with Italian Albert took place in Soho, when he and I had a rendezvous with Philadelphia Mafia boss Angelo Bruno. When Angelo Bruno came to London, Ron and I were invited to meet him at the Hilton Hotel. Angelo was very short with a stocky build. At the time of the meeting, he wore a beret which covered his bald head, and he wore glasses. We had a cup of coffee with him, and he asked questions about London, centered around the gambling scene. Years later, Bruno was shot dead, riddled with bullets as he sat in his car. Ronnie and I often had visitors from overseas at our clubs, businessmen and villains whose influence was far greater than our own. One evening in 1966, I had a meet with some Americans in the Pigalle Restaurant Club in Regent Street. When I arrived, there were 4 Americans present. 2 of them I knew, and the other 2 were strangers. These people were men of respect, and I will never forget this particular night, as among this small group was a small-built, dark-skinned man of about 70 years of age. He was obviously Sicilian, and it was quite clear to me that his 3 friends held him in some reverence. At one stage of the conversation, someone passed the cigarettes around, and I lit my lighter for one of the men who was to my left. As I did so, he said to me in a friendly tone of voice, "Reg, would you light the cigarette of our friend here first out of respect because he is the elder?" The friend on my left gestured with his hand, indicating the Sicilian on my right. This was a lesson in respect I shall never forget. The names of these men will remain unsaid. Throughout the night, I learned that the elder man who was held in such reverence was a Don of Dons. And that brings us to the end for this episode. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly, moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.